This video is sponsored by Hattons of London, specialists in rare and exclusive coins. Celebrate 100 years since the naming of Flying Scotsman with the release of this world-first range of 22-carat gold sovereign coins. Click the link in the description below to get yours now from just £69, or secure the more exclusive double sovereign in the range and receive a piece of authentic Flying Scotsman boiler tube, so you can actually own your very own piece of Britain's most famous locomotive. And if you like this episode, then you can pre-order it now as one of 5 episodes on Steam Locos In Profile Volume 7. Stick around until the end of the video for full details. Stars, granges, counties, manors, halls, castles, kings. All Great Western 460s flying the flag of Swindon engineering for over a century. But the flag had to be raised by something, and so it was in 1896 with this. I know, it's not what I was expecting either. This was William Dean's Crocodile number 36, and it was basically an experiment to see if a single engine could do the work of 2 smaller engines between Swindon and the South Wales collieries, which it could. But then, in 1902, Dean retired, and his assistant, George Jackson Churchward, took over with a plan to completely overhaul Swindon's output, which he did, with a fleet of these. The Saint was designed to run non-stop from Paddington to Plymouth, binging less coal and water than the Dean singles. And immediately you can see the jump in design from Dean's Crocodile. The ancient outside frames are now behind the 6-foot 8.5-inch diameter driving wheels. The boiler is tapered instead of parallel. The firebox is a sloping bell pair instead of an arched round top. But like the perfect Yorkshire pudding, the recipe took a few attempts to get right. The first prototype, number 100, was built in 1902 with a short 200 psi parallel boiler. A follow-up, number 98, came in March 1903 with a slight cone in the boiler for better steaming space. But the production ones were built around the third prototype, number 171. This one was built with the full-length tapered boiler, and it was bumped up to 225 psi with superheating. As a result, its tractive effort increased from £20,530 to nearly £24,400, so that's nearly a 20% increase in the space of 3 engines. In the end, 77 Saints were built by 1913. The Great Western Main Line was often nicknamed Brunel's billiard table, simply because the man went out of his way to make it as flat as he could, even though hardly any of it was actually level. But when it got to the old South Devon system west of Exeter, it had to climb some pretty steep banks over Dainton, Hemerdon and Rattery. The steepest of these was 2.5 miles of 1 in 42. With 6-foot 8.5-inch driving wheels, you'd think a Saint would get as far as Newton Abbot and then cry off sick. But the Great Western had an ingenious solution: the slip coaches. The idea was the Riviera Express would set off from Paddington with 11 coaches and then drop them off at wayside stations one by one on the move. So when it reached Newton Abbot, the 11-coach train was down to 6, and the big-wheeled express engine could get over the hills more easily. But the Saints weren't successful by operational convenience. The engine was a big hit for 2 reasons: the valves and the boiler. The valves had longer travel than their predecessors, allowing steam to flow through the cylinders with less resistance and therefore improve performance. This principle would eventually be adopted across the most successful LMS and LNER types. And then there's the new type of boiler. Until the early 20th century, most boilers were low pressure, parallel, and had a round top firebox. But Churchwood looked at locomotives from overseas and saw that some of theirs were tapered. Some of them worked at a much higher pressure and had the Belgian Belpaire firebox. The principle here is you can squeeze a bit more heating surface into the boiler and keep steam hotter in a bigger space. Add an increased pressure to this, and you've got a boiler that can sustain more power for longer use.
In order to understand why this boiler is such a big deal, I want you to imagine for a moment 225 pounds, or about 102 kilos of force, trying to break its way out of a space equivalent to this billiard chalk. Then I want you to remember that the barrel on a Swindon Standard No. 1 boiler, no firebox, no tubes, just the barrel alone, can hold 2.2 million of these chalks. Now I'll save you the maths because they were done by someone far more intelligent than me, but when it's at full working pressure, the actual energy that this boiler produces is equivalent to 5,890 kilowatts, enough to recharge about 140 Nissan Leafs at once.
So good was this boiler that it ended up being used on the 2800s, Stars, Halls, modified Halls, and Granges. So what did the crews think about these supposedly holy machines? Fireman Harold Gasson once said in his memoirs that a castle would run, but a saint would lope. There was another fireman named Richard Potts who only had one firing turn on a Saint, working a loose-coupled freight from Birmingham to Banbury, but states in his testimony that his driver told him not to bother shutting the firehole doors between shovels of coal, because a Saint would steam with the doors wide open. On 17 coach trains between Shrewsbury and Pontypool Road, these engines gained the nickname Hereford Castles, as they shared these runs with the much bigger Castle 460s, but still kept at the same time. The Great Western's publicity department loved these things, naming them after saints, courts, and ladies. One of them worked the first 2-hour express from Birmingham to Paddington. Another worked the first Cheltenham Flyer service in 1923. This became famous for being the fastest named train in the world, covering the 77.25 miles between Swindon and Paddington in 75 minutes. A century on, it was possible to do the same journey in 47 minutes, but in 1923, nothing could match that. There was even talk of one of these engines, number 2903 Lady of Leon, reportedly reaching 120 miles an hour, but chance will be a fine thing. If you thought City of Churro's 100 mile an hour claim was unofficial, this one was fake moon landing levels of conspiracy theory. The Saint might have been good, but in engineering terms it was hardly A4 beating. In reality, one of these could happily reach over 80 miles an hour, but faster than that, and the crew might have needed seatbelts. That being said, Lady of Leon did manage to run from Paddington to Exeter in 3 hours. Keep in mind the distance along the Reading-Taunton trunk route opened in 1906 was around 173 miles, meaning the average mile must have been covered in less than 61 seconds. As a step up from the previous regime, the Saints proved to carry a lot of weight on their shoulders. But every test of strength can show where the limit is.
The boiler may be advanced, but the cab isn't. I mean, okay, you got a cab, which means you can shield yourself from oncoming draft, but when it rains, you've got more chance of dodging bullets than staying dry. Oh, and that thing about the crew needing seatbelts, they barely got seats. So if you tried to drive this thing sitting down, then you need Inspector Gadget's arms.
Thus continues the need of storm sheet between cab and tender, which would carry on with Great Western designs for the next 50 years or so. 14 of the Saints were initially built as 442s instead of 460s, similar to a trio of French de Glen compounds tested by Churchward in the early 1900s. These ones proved that a two-cylinder engine was fine, but they had less grip than the 460s, so all Atlantic versions were rebuilt by 1913. Some Saints were fitted with a screw reverser instead of a lever one, but this was positioned so awkwardly that the driver had to lean sideways over it in order to see where he was going, a movement otherwise known as the 29 bend. And the large driving wheels may provide a high turn of speed, but it can be a struggle to get up to speed.
It's a bit like when you're driving a car or riding a bicycle and you set off in a high gear instead of a low one. It's possible to get moving, but the strain that it puts on the source of power, i.e. the boiler and cylinders, becomes a bit too high. And starting in a high gear on steep hills? Forget it.
Perhaps the main problem the Saints faced was evolution. On average, rolling stock has a tendency to be replaced every 20 to 30 years, and in the Churchward and Collet era, the Great Western kept trying to effectively reinvent their fleet even quicker than that. So it was in 1924 when number 2925 St. Martin was rebuilt into the prototype for these. The Hall had the same boiler, but had smaller driving wheels to develop a higher tractive effort and quicker acceleration. What's more, a Hall was better suited to fast freight than a Saint, hence their success as mixed traffic machines. So the Saint's top link work came under threat. But the Hall wasn't the only fuel being added to the fire. In 1923, Charles Collet fitted the chassis from a Star with a larger boiler to create the first of the castles. The Saints were delegated to cross-country work and other slow duties, but with halls and grangers rolling off the production line, the Saints were being broken up for scrap as early as 1931. Clinging on for dear life, the last surviving Saints remained in traffic until October 1953, with the prototype Hall rebuild going 6 years later. Word has it the final withdrawn Saint, number 2920 St. David, sat outside Swindon Works for a month while her fate was decided. But with over 2 million miles on the clock, her condition was extremely poor. So even with the highest recorded mileage of any Great Western machine, she was scrapped. With no Saints surviving into the 1960s, it's hardly surprising that none were preserved. They were simply withdrawn too early before anybody, outside Swindon, had the chance to save one. But even if they were gone, the Saints were never forgotten. Archive programs on VHS, like Decades of Steam, showed Saints at work in their heyday. There was talk of them in railway magazines, and model engineers built scaled-down replicas of them, such as this 7¼ gauge one, built in 1974 and seen here running on the Bentley Miniature Railway in Sussex. So even if none were around to be seen, the Saints remained etched on the minds of new generations of rail fans. Even I had a Saint at one point.
Here it is, look. Well used and a bit battered, I know, but it shows how much they were loved. I know it's really just Hornby's old haul tooling with bigger wheels, and it's driven by one of those screechy Ringfield motors in the tender, but it shows they existed.
But what existed in Steam days didn't in preservation. So what to do? Well, why not build one? In 1974, the Great Western Society at Didcot proposed a bit of reverse evolution. Seeing as Collet used a Saint to make the first hull, why not use a hull to make a new Saint? With the chassis and boiler from number 4942 Maindy Hall, new driving wheels and straightened frames, the new Saint, number 2999 Lady of Legend, was finally outshopped in April 2019, and has since been touring the Heritage Railway circuit as a major attraction. But has this resulted in a saint or a sinner? Some say it's sacrilegious to turn an existing steam engine into another kind of steam engine, and if only one or two hulls were saved, then it would be easy to see why people would get upset. But while Lady of Legend was going on, there were 14 other hulls in preservation, one of which was also being used as a donor for a new county and a new grange. So with that in mind, I came to this conclusion in a previous episode.
But as was the case with the large prairies and the austerities and so on, there was enough of these engines knocking about for someone to say, I know, let's turn this into a Saint, without getting shot by angry purists.
And that seems to have been exactly what's happened.
There was a time when there were none of these things preserved and everyone was saying, oh, we should build one, they were so important, they were nice to have, blah 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 blah. Well, now someone has. It may not be to everyone's liking, and some people may get bored stiff of seeing it, I know, but it still tells a physical part of the story, a part that preservation would have somehow been worse off without.
The Saint wasn't the first 460 in Great Britain, nor the most powerful, the most protective, the fastest, the most sophisticated, nor have been the best represented in preservation. But it was an important step in British locomotive history, one that set the template for a whole stairway of heavenly engines after it. The Highland Railway Jones Goods was the pioneer British 460, making the Saint something like a second mouse. But don't forget, it's the second mouse that gets the cheese. Oh great, you're still watching. Thanks for hanging around. Now available to pre-order on DVD, Steam Locos In Profile Volume 7 consists of 4 of the latest episodes of Slips from 2024. Those being the London and South Western Adams T3s, the Lancashire and Yorkshire 060 goods engines, the London Brighton and South Coast Railway Marsh Atlantics, and this one, the GWR Saints. But every Slips volume has a bonus film, and this is no exception. On Volume 7, the bonus film will be on the 2-foot 3-inch gauge Corris Falcon 042 saddle tanks. Like previous DVD releases, Volume 7 can be purchased from www.e-gmedia.co.uk/shop. Currently priced at £19.99 plus postage and packing, with worldwide shipping available and currently due for release on Monday, December the 2nd. But don't worry, the Chorus Falcon film will also be released on Patreon and YouTube membership for complete Slips subscribers. From £6.50 per month, you can gain access to new videos up to a month in advance and watch a back catalogue of over 50 previous episodes of Slips, including the Manx and Miniatures and USA releases, along with all previous episodes and DVD exclusive content, such as the Bortnamona Barclays, the Harts Mountain 210-2 tanks, the Baldwin 1012Ds, the Polish OL49s, and much, much more. For £9 per month, you can then see feature-length content, such as Going Great Central, Beyond the Sunset, Midland and Great Northern Retraced, the 2023 and 24 Imlek specials, and some outtakes of my time in the USA. But if you're still interested in hard copy, you can also pre-order our 2025 calendar, priced at £10.99 with worldwide shipping available and also due for release on Monday, December the 2nd. Signed copies are available for £1 extra and feature classes that have been previously covered on Slips and also due to be covered at some point in the future.